Despite having a relatively small gender gap in Southeast Asia, the Philippines remains to be a patriarchal society. Centuries of colonialism embedded a particular gender ideology that relegated women and other gender minorities in the sidelines. In the struggle for gender equality, it is imperative that we acknowledge and criticize the way that women were represented in the body of knowledge, particularly in history. In this episode of Contested Philippine Histories, let us appraise how women were written and represented in Philippine history, and why does it matter? This is Vegal Porha.
This is Aaron Maliari.
And this is Lee Candelaria.
And you were listening to podcasts, Conversations on Philippine History, Politics, and Society. I would not consider myself an expert in women's history or feminist history. But of course, this issue is something that is, really close to my heart as a woman and of course, as a feminist. Kasi totoo naman, bilang historians at bilang scholars, kailangan lagi tayong merong pagkataya regarding the roles that history played, both in the perennial gender inequality and patriarchy in the Philippine society.
In the previous episode, nabanggit natin that knowledge production is always influenced by certain power relations and power dynamics that may serve certain interests. At hindi lamang mga interest ng mga individual like Ferdinand Marcos, for example, but also of certain structures that benefit a sector and oppresses another.
Tama, no? I think ang isa sa mga issue regarding the question on the way that women or any other sector really is written in history is the question on the neutrality of historical knowledge. So we need to question, is historical knowledge really ever neutral? I think alam natin ang sagot dyan. But more importantly, tulad nga ng sabi ni Aaron, how historical knowledge has the power to change or to sustain systems and structures.
Yes, and when we say systems and structures, kasama dyan lahat like, capitalism, feudalism, imperialism, to name a few. Pero in this episode, we are zooming into the issue of gender. Bakit? Well, kasi mahalaga siya, una sa lahat. Pero at the same time, patriarchy does not only affect gender relations. It also affects almost every aspect of our society. I think there ought to be an explanation why Filipinos gravitate towards macho leaders like Duterte, or why Filipinos tolerate a very punitive approach to drug problems or crimes, or why people are drawn toward, yung mga TV shows, yung mga teleserye na kabit-kabit, mga genre, or yung mga bad boy to good boy na mga palabas sa TV. From politics to culture, apektado ng kung ano mang kaisipang dulot ng patriarka. O basically, nung sistema na nagbibigay ng mas madaming kapangyarihan sa mga lalaki kaysa sa mga babae. So politics, culture, and of course, history and scholarship aren't exempt.
So, scrutinizing the way in which women are represented in history is indeed an important first step into, in a way, improve on our historical knowledge. At syempre, ang dapat unang gawin dyan, i-acknowledge natin na may problema. At medyo complex yung problema na yan. Ako, gusto ko simulan siguro dun sa fact na majority ng mga historians natin, lalaki. Like, largely outnumbered ang mga kababaihan sa disiplina.
Very true. Sige, tignan na lang natin ang department kung saan tayo nanggaling, ang UP Department of History. Sa kasalukuyan, mabibilang mo sa daliri ang babaeng faculty members. I'm not saying, of course, that is brought about by sexism or whatnot. I am just demonstrating that in one of the largest and oldest history departments in the Philippines, makikita yung problema sa kakulangan ng mga female historians. But of course, this is not to discount the fact that many of our leading historians who happen to be female came from this department.
Indeed. The Dean of the College of Social Sciences and Philosophy herself, kung saan dinakapailalim ang Department of History, ay si Dr. Bernadette Abrera, na isang kilalang cultural historian. And former NHCP Chair Maria Serena Jokno ay galing din sa parehong departamento. At syempre, the leading scholar of women's history in the country, Professor Emerita Maria Luisa Camagay, is also from the department. And Dr. Camagay herself would say that, one of the reasons why women were underrepresented in the nation's historical canon was because history is mostly recorded by men. So, anong point nitong pag-appraise natin sa relatively few numbers of female historians in the country? Simple lang naman. Men are less likely to take interest in the history of women. In the same way that, most post-colonial scholars are scholars from the global south, or most historians who would take interest in the local history of Mindanao, for example, would come from Mindanao. But, deliberately or not, male historians who compose the majority of our historians paid little to no attention to the female experience in their narratives.
And the underrepresentation of women in our history, sadya man o hindi, had negative effects on the way that women were portrayed in history and in other bodies of knowledge, including, for example, literature, mass media, religious doctrine, and even state propaganda. One example that I can think of is Rizal's heroine in the novels, si Maria Clara. In an article entitled Maria Clara, Paragon or Caricature, Salvador Lopez inquired into this character. So basically, tinatanong niya, did Rizal intend Maria Clara to be the role model of the Filipino women? Or was her character actually a mockery?
That's an important question, no? Kasi how did Rizal portray Maria Clara? Una, physically, Maria Clara was the quintessential mestiza. Maputi, brown eyes, mamula-mula ang pisngi, rosy lips. Tapos yung character niya, di ba? Docile, submissive, painfully shy and coy, fragile, faints at the slightest provocation, ganyan. Tsaka di ba maaalala ninyo yung scene na kakauwi ni Ibarra galing Espanya. Tapos syempre, he wanted to see Maria Clara after a long time. So bumisita siya, anong ginawa ni Maria Clara? Nagtago siya at nagrosaryo.
So imagine, di mo nakita yung jowa mo for 7 years, tapos nung andyan, imbis na salubungin mo, nagpray mo na siya. Ano kayang ipinagpray niya, no? I mean, syempre, pag present standard, ang absurd. But yes, Maria Clara was a bad character and certainly a bad role model. I would argue, lalo na, by present standards. Kasi regardless if Rizal intended her to be the ideal Filipina or a mockery of the overly conservative women or native women, yung impact niya, I would say, ay, adverse. Sabi nga nila, Maria Clara was the greatest tragedy inflicted to Filipino women of the 20th century. Precisely because her character set the standard of what a dalagang Pilipina should be like, di ba? So, mayumi, di makabasag pinggan, someone in need of protection, etc., etc. So, dito may kita how the way women are portrayed could actually really affect them. Example, when women started demanding for their right to vote in the early 20th century, ano yung counter-argument madalas ng mga male politicians who opposed it? Sabi nila, women should not be allowed to vote or to dabble in politics because, their purity would be soiled by the dirty politics in the Philippines. So, di ba, sobrang ridiculous.
Yeah. Saka even in, more recent historical works, pag napag-uusapan yung mga naging ambag ng kababaihan sa mga key historical periods like the Philippine Revolution and the Filipino-American War, for example, lagi lang sasabihin, they took charge of the logistics, they kept the money of the katipunan, or they tended to the wounds of the fighters, di ba? Parang through organizations like the Red Cross, mga ganyan, no? So, samantalang mayroong mga kababaihan who actually fought in the battlefield, di ba? These things are not, readily recognized or hindi masyadong na-exalt sa narratives, and women are always typecast na ganun yung roles.
Totoo yan. So, halimbawa, sa Katipunan, ang tingin kay Tandang Sora ay the mother of the Katipunan. So, mother kasi nagkakalinga ang mga Katipunero. Or Trinidad Tecson, the mother of the Biak na Bato. When in fact, si Trinidad Tecson ay fighter din naman. So, mas na-highlight yung role niya as a woman who is caring more than, kasi mother yung bansag, pero more than being a mother, she's also a fighter. Pero syempre, totoo rin naman kasi women were somehow given limited opportunities in key historical moments. Patriarchy entailed the revolution, the war, the nascent republic to be dominated by men. The challenge, I think, is to recognize this historical fact and to surface it as a problem. I think aside from making sure that women are represented in history, it is also important to reflect in our narrative how women were historically oppressed and marginalized.
And this is true across historical periods, At the onset of the Spanish colonization, for example, maraming pagbabago yung mangyayari. Some of the datus of the pre-colonial times were eventually co-opted in the new colonial society. They were turned into the Principalia class. But what about the babaylan? They weren't only replaced or displaced by the friars, they were also demonized. I think nabanggit ito sa isa nating episode. The native women's bodies and sexualities were also policed and controlled at this period. And of course, they were given far less opportunities in terms of education, for example. At itong ganitong klaseng setup ay magpapatuloy hanggang American period.
So during the American colonial period naman, totoong napayagan yung mga babaeng mag-enroll sa mga schools, universities. Ilan sa kanila naging doctors, teachers, mga negosyante. Pero limitado pa rin yung freedoms nila. Kasi yun nga, halos 30 years nilaban yung karapatan nilang bumoto, 'di ba? Yung women's suffragette movement. Hindi din sila agad napayagan na magkaroon ng properties na di alam ng mga asawa nila. Imagine, kailangan alam ng asawa nila.
At nung pumasok ang Second World War, women were also subjected to a different kind of suffering. They weren't just subjected to the usual ravages of war like death, starvation, and the like. A lot of women were also subjected to sexual violence and sexual slavery. And the Japanese in the Second Republic also seemingly became more progressive in showcasing the place of women in Philippine society. Sa isang artikulong isinulat ko, sorry shameless plugging na to, at nalathala recently sa journal na Plaridel, ito yung phenomenon na tinalakay ko. Bakit parang ang progressive, ang modern ng portrayal of women, at least in Japanese propaganda? They were shown to be productive members of society, taking on many different jobs, even police work, bus conductors, at iba pa. What I found is that this is all part of a ploy by the Japanese. More than envisioning a bigger space for women participation in society, ginamit nila ang kababaihan to portray that they are bringing normalcy in the country even during a time of war. So, if you can, please read my article. But I think this just shows, dapat tignan natin yung place ng kababaihan sa lipunan, not just because they have a place, but because ano yung lugar na ito? Does it really further women participation in society? Is it really empowering them?
That's a good point. And I think ipinapakita nitong mga specific periods na to that, in order for us to write women's history, hindi lang natin dapat i-affirm yung presence ng mga kababaihan. Kailangan nating i-record at i-acknowledge yung oppression na dinanas nila within this, very colonial and very patriarchal society.
And in the process, mas ma-underscore natin hindi lang yung halaga ng mga kababaihan, marirecognize din natin that women had to endure certain experiences na hindi kailanman mararanasan ng mga kalalakihan. I think from a male vantage point, learning about women's history would also help us check our privilege and acknowledge that maybe at some point, sadya man o hindi, privy tayo sa pagpapatuloy ng gender inequality. Sabi nga nila, knowing that there is a problem is already half of the solution.
Pero mahalaga din, aside from revealing what women had to endure throughout history, is to also tell how women fought against oppression and injustices. Hindi naman sila silent victims lang na tiniis yung mga pang-aapi ng mga kalalakihan. They really fought for their place and for their rights.
Tama. Now, at various points, women acted together to insist on their rights. No? I think the earliest feminist organization in the Philippines was established in 1905, the Asociación Feminista Filipina. No? But even before this, Dr. Maria Luisa Camagay wrote about how women working in cigarette factories o yung mga cigarreras in Manila actually went on strike when they didn't like how management treated them. Saka yung pag-organize ng women's workers, madalas ina-attribute na nagsimula lang noong martial law period. Pero feminist and scholar Judy Tagiwalo wrote a dissertation on how women workers actually engaged in the labor movement even before the war.
Yes, and speaking of pre-war period, we also had our own suffragettes. I mean, maraming mga nagawang pelikula featuring the suffragettes of the United States. Meron din tayo dito sa Pilipinas. So, and they were multiple generations of women who fought for the right to vote, against a government dominated by rich and conservative men. Imagine, nagsimula yung kampanya nila mga 1909 at nakuha lang nila yung karapatang bumoto 1937. But, they persisted. And of course, fast forward to the years of martial law, women's groups fought against gender inequality, against violence against women, and for their rights to equal economic and social opportunities. So, lumitaw yung makibaka o malayang kilusan ng bagong kababaihan, Filipina o kilusang kababaihang Pilipina, at iba pa. So, habang nag-develop ang feminism sa daigdig, kasabay syempre ang feminismo at women's movement sa Pilipinas.
So, Vec, bilang babae at bilang babaeng historian, ano ang gusto mong sabihin sa mga kapwa mo historiador na mga lalaki kagaya namin at sabi mo nga kagaya ng karamihan sa ating colleagues sa disiplina?
Well, I am not one to, prohibit or, bash men who take interest in writing women's history katulad ni Lee, Go for it. Kailangan natin 'yan. Kailangan natin ng mas productive na scholarship in this, area. Pero I would still, appeal that they be mindful of the space that they occupy in the conversation. Yes, we need more men who understand the historical struggle for gender equality, the historical marginalization suffered by women, by homosexuals, and other gender minorities. But I think it would help the cause a lot if, men or male historians would recognize that in the status quo, the male voice is always louder. And they should consciously make an effort, not really to silence themselves, but to help the female voice to resonate more, especially in issues that, primarily concern them.
And I appreciate this reminder kasi minsan yung iba sa atin, because of our, passion for historical scholarship and in our ardent desire to contribute to historical knowledge, nakakalimutan natin that issues and topics don't actually exist in a vacuum. May power balance or imbalance na involved dyan.
Ayan, so another historical issue unpacked. No? So in the next episode, ang pag-uusapan naman natin ay isa na namang sektor sa Philippine society. Very important conversation ang magaganap because we will be talking about the Moros, the Muslim Filipinos sa ating historical experience. No? So abangan nyo yan next Saturday. Tuloy-tuloy lang ang pakikinig, and of course, you can find us in Spotify, Apple, Google Podcasts, Anchor, at ano pa mang streaming apps na inyong ginagamit to listen to your podcasts.
And our episodes are also on YouTube. You may subscribe to our YouTube channel, Podcast TV. Hanapin nyo din kami sa social media. We are on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
And if you want to learn more about podcasts, you may visit our website, podcast.org. And if you like this episode, please share this to your friends and let's enjoy the show together. Thank you for listening, and as always, have a good day.